Okay, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to wrap up Chapter 5 of the Rathus Introductory Psychology text. We're going to kind of look at a couple more theories about learning. In the previous video, we looked at operant conditioning, the learning of operant behaviors or voluntary behaviors, learning from rewards and consequences. So we're going to kind of switch gears and look at some cognitive elements of learning, sort of what's going on between the ears. And the first topic we're going to look at is called latent learning, or learning that is sort of hidden or concealed. And I'm going to give you an example of this in an experiment, and then also talk about how this is probably something you've experienced in your everyday life, especially as a student. So this idea that sometimes that learning is hidden, that sometimes we don't get that immediate feedback about what we learn right away. And some research by a psychologist named E.C. Tolman kind of shows this with rats. And what Tolman did is he put some rats in a maze that had food at the end of the maze and some that did not. And at first, I think the data show that the mice with the food at the end of their maze worked faster. They could maybe smell it or anticipated food. And the mice that did not have access to food in their maze, yeah, they finished, but maybe a little bit slower. And they took out, waited 10 days and put these same mice back in through the same mazes, and what they found was that the mice that didn't have food still the second time around got through the maze just as quickly as the mice who were exposed and given to food, who were given food. And Tolman's hypothesis behind this, or explanation behind this, was, well, yeah, even though they were not motivated in the moment, at the time both mice were developing these sort of mental maps, cognitive maps, or mental representation of the environment. It just wasn't until the second time, when those rats who didn't get food, they were motivated, they got food this time, they were more motivated and they were able to get through. They used this cognitive map, and once motivation kind of kicked in, they're like, hey, we've used this before, we've been here before. And I think latent learning is something we all do, especially in school. You read a chapter, you're going to finish reading your chapter textbook on chapter 5, and you're not going to get this immediate feedback like, hey, great job, you learned all this stuff about learning theory. Well, it won't be until you take your test on the chapter 5 test, and you figure out, okay, yeah, I really know learning theory, and you get the feedback of a good grade. Your learning is kind of hidden in this sense, or latent, until you have a reason to use it. So adding on to this, also we have contingency theory. This is kind of adding on to classical conditioning theory, but showing that learning only occurs when our conditioned stimulus provides us information about the unconditioned stimulus, when there is some kind of connection between the two, some kind of contextual information. And there's a really fascinating study by a researcher named, I'm probably mispronouncing their name, but it's Rescorla, and this is in 1967. And he had some results that are pretty interesting, to say the least. And so he used dogs, kind of like Pavlov did with his dogs. And he had these different phases of working with dogs. So each phase of his work paired a tone, which was the conditioned stimulus, with an electric shock, which was the unconditioned stimulus, but in different ways. With one group of animals, or dogs, the shock was consistently presented after the tone. So tone, shock, tone, shock, tone, shock. That is, the unconditioned stimulus followed on the heels of the conditioned stimulus, just like Pavlov's studies. The dogs in this group learned to show a fear response while the tone was presented. A second group of dogs heard an equal number of tones and received an equal number of electric shocks, but the shock never immediately followed the tone. In other words, the tone and the shock were not paired. Now, from the behaviorist perspective, the dogs should have learned to associate the tone and the shock, because one did not predict the other. But actually, in all actuality, the dogs learned quite a lot. They learned that they had nothing to fear when the tone was sounded. They showed vigilance and fear when the lab was quiet, and for the shock might come at any time, but they were calm in the presence of the tone. And then here we go, last group, the third group of dogs also received equal number of shocks, tones and shocks, but the stimuli were presented at random intervals. Occasionally they were paired, but most often they weren't. According to Rescorla, behaviorists might argue that intermittent pairing of the tones and shocks should have brought about some learning, but it didn't. The animals showed no fear in response to the tone. No response to the tone, and Rescorla suggests that the animals in this group learned nothing because the tones did not allow them to make predictions about electric shocks. Rescorla concluded that learning occurs only when the conditioned stimulus, in this case the tone, provides information about the conditioned stimulus. So if there is no connection between those two, then really learning does not take place. Is kind of the ultimate saying here. It's the context, it's the connections that they're forming, the associations that are being formed. So this takes us to our last theory, and that's observational learning. And this is how we learn simply by observing and watching other people. We can be reinforced by other people's behaviors. For example, you don't need, if you see an employee or a coworker at work get promoted or get a raise or get congratulations or a good job from the boss, you can mimic those sorts of behaviors and learn, okay, this is what I need to do to get a raise, or I need to get a job. Same thing in your classroom. You might mimic the behaviors and learn from the behaviors of people who are successful, who are studying, who are taking notes, asking questions, things like that. That's one of the best ways in which we learn. Let's see. So it's not only just enough to pay attention to something, you also have to practice it. I mean, observational learning, anytime we're trying to learn any sort of new procedure or skill, it takes a lot of practice. Maybe you've heard Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule before. You don't quite need to put in 10,000 hours to learn something, but you do need to practice to at least begin using those skills. We have neurons in our brain also that stimulate specifically when we are imitating behavior or we're trying to imitate behavior. They're called mirror neurons. So when we're watching someone else perform a behavior, it's like our brain is trying to do that same thing, only at the neural level. Now, because of this, there's been a lot of research that uses observational learning, Albert Bandura's theory of observational learning, and it applies it to kind of this idea of monkey see, monkey do, learning. We learn one thing, and we learn from watching other people, and there are implications of this in terms of consuming violent media. And not just, it's video games, it's music, television shows, Netflix, all these things that we consume, and sort of what are the impact. There are some people who like to make the claim that watching violent video games playing violent video games or watching violent television, makes people want to do violent things. And that's not exactly true. Again, we're getting back to the point of cause versus, causation does not prove correlation. There's really no evidence to suggest that playing violent video games causes people to become violent. That's not true at all, what we're saying. But there is a relationship, there is a correlation between, violent media consumption and more aggressive behavior. Again, it's not saying one causes the other. There could be other factors. There's definitely other factors involved. But we know that people who do consume a lot of violent media they have increased emotional arousal. They're more likely to kind of go off. They're more primed to be aggressive in their thoughts. They're much more likely to lack the inhibition to kind of like know that, hey, this is not a good time to be violent. I don't need to be violent right now. And again, this is not saying, you pick up Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty, you're going to go out and start fighting people or shooting people or whatever. It's not the case, but it definitely doesn't help things. If you're already an aggressive person and you're consuming a lot of violent media, probably isn't going to make you any less aggressive, I think is sort of the point. There's some other things, involved as well, not just the violence involved, but there's also stereotypes going on in violent media, especially with males and females. There are other things that obviously moderate the effect of consuming violent media, like, how connected you are socially, academic achievement. Those are also important things. People who are connected socially, even if they consume violent video games, are not going to go out and shoot up their school or, get into a fight at the bar or do something crazy, violent or something. They have these social bonds that kind of keep them in check, keep them in tie with, reality. But it's the people who consume a lot of violent material, who are maybe social outcasts, who don't have a lot of social connectedness, that those sort of moderating variables could play a big factor in whether somebody's aggressive or violent or not. So again, there's a sort of the circular correlation research between exposure to violent media and aggressive behavior. There also might be family factors involved, environmental factors. It's not just if you watch it, but if you have coming from homes where there's a lot of maybe aggression in the family, like parent rejection or maybe even use of physical punishment. And I'm not just saying spanking, but if you have parents who are maybe going beyond spanking or spanking a lot. I know plenty of people, myself included, have been raised, by family members who spanked. You were spanked as a child. I was too, and most of us are not violent people, and I would never say spanking causes violence or anything like that. But it definitely kind of sends a sort of message that, hey, it's okay. You start sending a message very early on to your children, hey, that, this is how we solve problems, using violence, using aggression. And I understand it, in some cases, maybe that is like the only solution. I'm not trying to say that there's anything wrong with parents who spank their children, but I just think we need to be careful, I suppose, how I'm not a parent, so I have nothing to speak on this, but I think it's just something to be sort of mindful of and be aware of. So basically, children who believe violence is inappropriate are less likely to be aggressive. That's very straightforward. If you have parents who are teaching these, it's inappropriate to hit, it's inappropriate to be violent, it's inappropriate to be aggressive, those kids learn that. If you teach that very early on, kids learn that pretty quickly and will act accordingly. So there is a connection between violence in media and aggressive behavior, but it's not saying one causes the other here. In this depiction, we see it's somewhat cyclical. There's a lot going on, consuming the violent media, aggressive behavior, but already having maybe a predisposition. Someone who already has a predisposition towards aggressive behavior is probably more likely to seek out violent media in the first place than somebody who doesn't. So there's other factors involved. It's not just X causes Y. There's much more below the surface that's going on. So, those of you who have children, or those of you who are thinking about having children, things you can consider as far as imitating media violence or teaching children not to imitate media violence is that, the things that you see on TV or Netflix or in video games, those don't represent how actually people are in real life. They're glorifications and their exaggerations, and most people will resolve their conflicts in non-violent means. You're not going to just pick up a car like you would in Grand Theft Auto and go run somebody over, or do the Fortnite dance on them or whatever after you run them over. It's really just about most people will resolve their problems in other ways. So in real life, the consequences of violence are harmful to the victim and to the aggressor. It may feel great to want to go up and just punch somebody or, get your aggression out. But hey, you walk up and punch somebody, then the next thing you know, you just broke your hand and you have some sort of assault charge on your hand. So yeah, that may make you feel good in the moment, but when you're wrapping your hand up at the hospital, when you're getting that criminal charge, it's probably not a lot of fun. Then at that point, it does have real life consequences for you and the other person. Bandura, again, I think I mentioned Bandura. He's the one who came up with this theory of observational learning. It's part of a much broader theory in psychology called social cognitive theory. But he was really interested in the idea of looking at how aggressive behavior is influenced by the media. So he conducted a famous study with children in aggressive media back whenever the television was first being introduced, like color television. We're talking about like the 1960s, I believe. And it's called the Bobo doll experiment. And this is a Bobo doll. Oops, sorry. This is a Bobo doll right here, if you can't tell. It's one of those dolls that'll wobble. It'll wobble back and forth, but it always comes back to its center of gravity. And Bandura, he showed these children here in this video, you can do this picture here, he showed these children this video of a woman playing with the Bobo doll, but she's being very aggressive. So some children saw this video here, this top bar, and others didn't. And he put both groups of children individually into a room with some play toys and just kind of watched their behavior. And what he noticed was the children who watched this video of this lady beating up the Bobo doll, when they went into the room to play with the toy, guess what they're doing? He's punching the Bobo doll. She's sitting on top of the doll just like the woman in the video. They're both kicking it and punching it using weapons. So, it's kind of that monkey see, monkey do. They realize, oh, that this is what I just watched, and this is how you play with the Bobo doll. Again, it's not saying that watching this video caused this to happen. I mean, children are really impressionable at this age. I mean, probably don't know a lot of what they're doing at this age, but, it's still just really fascinating to see how quickly children mimic and pick up behaviors. Okay, truth or fiction, despite all the media hoopla, no scientific connection has been established between violence in the media and real-life aggression. What do you think? Pause the video, come back and check your comprehension. That is absolute false. We know that one does not cause the other. We know that people don't watch, Grand Theft Auto video games or play them and all of a sudden they're violent people. No, there's a lot more going on there, but it definitely doesn't help things. Okay, that's it for Chapter 5. That was probably one of the shortest videos I'll cover in this course, but that wraps up Chapter 5. We will stop here. I think our next chapter is on memory, so we'll pick up there in the Chapter 6 of the Rathus text. So thanks for tuning in. I'll see you all next time.